Thank you again. It's my pleasure to now introduce our final presenter in this session. Tanya Landau is a PhD student in psychology at Northwestern University. She's also a Mellon Cluster Fellow in Critical Theory and a member of the Global Politics Study Group. She also holds a master's degree in vocal arts from Roosevelt and Chicago College. Her research explores musical expressions of individual, cultural, and political identity among displaced. The paper today is titled Sounding Jewish, Shostakovich's Existential Humor, Satires. Please join me in welcome.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the committee so much for welcoming here to Butano. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you to my fellow panelists, Joshua and Tanya, for incredible papers, and for Keenan for chairing this session. Thank you so much for being here. И еще большое спасибо для нашего русских коллег, которые тоже здесь с нами. Это очень большое удовольствие. Спасибо. In June 1960, Shostakovich made the decision to join the Communist Party. Interpreted by scholars in conflicting ways, some argue it was an act of commitment, while others acknowledge it as a result of political pressure. Shostakovich was subsequently appointed as chairman of the Union of Composers, solidifying his commitment to the Soviet Union amongst personal crises. On returning from Dresden, having witnessed the horrifying aftermath of the 1945 firebombings, Shostakovich composed not only his infamous Eighth Quartet, but also the rarely discussed song cycle, Satires, Pictures of the Past. Setting 5 poems by turn-of-the-century poet Sasha Chorny, or as he was known at birth, Alexander Mikhailovich Glickberg, was well known for his satirical poetry, which developed as a result of the turn of the 20th century with the development of the modern style. Modernism encouraged rebellion and experimentation with an emphasis on subjectivity and abstraction as industrialization forever changed the day-to-day life of the average individual. Chorny's poetry subsequently reflects a romanticized, nostalgic viewpoint to the past that is simultaneously ironic in its self-deprecating quality, with a focus on the drudgery of everyday life. Here I have the Russian version, and I will read the English translation, as he writes in the 5th piece, the Kreutzer Sonata. The tenant sits on a suitcase and pensively examines the floor. The same old chairs and bed and table, the same old upholstery on the couch, the same old bigos for dinner, but somehow everything seems to look different. Satires, Chorny's published book of his verses from 1910, sarcastically pointed out the foolishness of blindly following and embracing the hysteria of post-revolutionary ideas, with a pointed and often deprecating look past. Thus, while officials may have assumed that Shostakovich's satires were intended to satirize the pre-Soviet revolutionary past, they very much commented on his present. The subtitle of the piece, Pictures of the Past, demonstrates this double meaning. As the great Russian soprano Galina Vishnevskaya recalls, it was her idea to add the subtitle with the hopes the authorities would see the set as a satire of imperialist Russia before the Communist Revolution. The composer and performers alike, however, anticipated that the public might be able to understand the subliminary commentary, with the subtitle further reflecting the ironic existence of the piece as both official and unofficial. Expressing musically Chorny's ironic poetics, Shostakovich expressed the unsaid through musical humor, which allowed him to critique the oppressive environment he found himself in, and perhaps finding some existential relief along the way. So, the elephant in the room. Shostakovich's Jewishness. The Jewish ethos comes from a Jewish mode of awareness of existence, one in which it is by nature self-deprecating as an inescapable human responsibility comes to expect justice in a hopelessly unjust world. Shostakovich's commitment to Jewish musical idioms are evident in his compositions, with works such as the song cycle from Jewish folk poetry and his 13th Symphony. Much of his musical themes utilize traditional Jewish elements, such as harmonic minor modes and syncopated rhythms. However, he was not himself Jewish. Rather, he was surrounded by Russian Jews throughout his life, maintaining close relationships with individuals such as Solomon Michels, Mieczysław Weinberg, Leonid Fleischmann, and others that undoubtedly influenced his personal philosophy and worldview. One of the ways in which this philosophy and worldview worked within the Soviet Union was due to the lack of an official religion, with most religiosity remaining hidden. Thus, this kind of Jewishness is able to manifest in Shostakovich's works largely because of the secular culture within the Soviet Union. This influence goes beyond the composer's compositions, with extensive Jewish representation within Eastern Europe and Russia evident in literature, art, film, and many other art forms. From Shalom Aleichem, whose work is idiomatically representative of Ashkenazi culture, to Sasha Chorny, whose ironic poetics take a Jewish modernist twist in comparison to Aleichem's shtetl view. In Shalom Aleichen's classic tale, Fiddler on the Roof, the Jewish people are discussed as occupying a precariousness throughout history while presenting an example of Jewish life, characters, and humor. In Conversations with God, Tanya the milkman expresses the irony of the Jewish existence, addressing the compassionate and merciful God while simultaneously enduring his all-powerful justice. As musicologist S.D. Scheinberg explores, quote, in spite of his failed existential query for justice, there's no trace of Russian nihilism in the Jewish milkman's attitude. Weighed down by fatal blows, Tevye, whose name means the goodness of God, uses the Jewish ethos to transfigure his suffering into a special kind of existential philosophy, Jewish irony. Perhaps this Jewish existential irony is where we find the realization of Shostakovich's unique idiomatic humor. By using ironic musical elements, Shostakovich infuses his music with an enduring thread of humor that, in my view, finds its foundations not within Russian nihilism, but rather within the existential and moral inquiries of Jewish ethos. While Jewish existential irony has been explored as manifested in his instrumental music by S.D. Scheinberg, for example, in her monograph, there's yet to be significant literature addressing this type of irony within his vocal works. By looking closely at Shostakovich's song cycle from 1960, Satires, Pictures of the Past, we see how Shostakovich's idiomatic humor and musical style is influenced by an ironic philosophical viewpoint, and along with Sasha Chorny's text, the piece takes on dual meanings and subliminal expressivities. Musical influences can be discovered through upbringing and worldviews that are informed by shared culture. One example of a shared cultural influence in Russia is found through the works of Dostoevsky. In Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky offers an ironic reflection on existential angst. The hero, or rather anti-hero, is self-aware, but the self-awareness is exaggerated to the point of self-loathing. The protagonist simultaneously presents himself as both sick, angry, and unattractive, while at the same time decent and respectable. He loathes his own misery, and as a result feels a kind of existential powerlessness, leading to a philosophical viewpoint that's nihilistic at its core. Now, growing up within a shared culture and education, Shostakovich was undoubtedly influenced by Dostoevsky and his ruminations on existential angst. However, his work does not constitute a surrender to nihilism. Even bleak and intensely sorrowful works, such as the Eighth Quartet, demonstrate an interwoven thread of irony. For example, in the aforementioned quartet, Shostakovich employs dysphoric musical devices, such as inflected modes, extreme tempi, and extreme dynamics, to achieve a kind of musical self-pity. These exaggerations imply a musical irony that leads to awkward dysphoric elements. These displays of personal suffering do not manifest within a traditional Dostoevskian worldview. Rather, in my view, they demonstrate a Jewish sense of humor and irony, while characterized by laughter at one's own tragedy, is markedly devoid of cruelty and nihilism. Shostakovich nuances both cultural influences in order to create an idiomatic compositional sound that is unique and, while often tragic, is simultaneously hopeful. So through my examination, three primary elements of musical irony emerge. Incongruities, ambiguity, and exaggeration based on S.D. Scheinberg's work, in which incongruous metric applications, ambiguous harmonic functions, and exaggerated musical cliches nuance and challenge established compositional norms. Incongruities rely primarily on context that refers to a pre-established expectation or musical norm. For example, the use of rhythmic elements or time signatures can imply a waltz or a march. However, change the mode, register, and timbre of the piece that uses a dance-like or culturally reified rhythm, and suddenly it can take on a complete new meaning. Elements of musical irony can also be implied through incongruities within the context of compositional idiosyncrasies, where a composer will do something unexpected or abrupt in the context of their own work in order to signify an ironic shift. Ambiguity can be generated by rhythmic elements, tonal and harmonic functions, unclear and shifting modes, melodic gestures, or dynamics. Thus, irony can even be found in the juxtaposition of ambiguous timbres and vectors. Exaggeration can be seen in the use of extreme dynamics or dynamic contrast, heavy chromaticism, and even the exaggeration of simplicity or the use of musical cliches. Exaggeration is often used to heighten existing emotions, such as anxiety, in order to subvert the audience's expectations, creating a self-referential irony that is self-deprecating by nature. So turning to my analysis of satire, I'm going to be focusing on the second piece in the set, Spring Awakening, or Весеннее Пробуждение, and see the manifestation of this existential irony in the text in this material. So existential irony implies a heightened emotional state, and as discussed previously, indicates a self-deprecation or even a self-annihilation that is expressed through ironic musical gestures that feature emotional suggestion, existential questioning, and laughter at one's own suffering. So to begin, I created this map of the piece, which highlights the moments of incongruity, irony, exaggeration, ambiguity, and a moment of realism, which I'll now discuss. This map shows the overall form of the piece and presents itself in a rondo-like fashion with a repeated refrain and contrasting episodes that sort of indicates an A-B-A-C-A pattern. The A sections include a quotation of the opening material of the well-known art song Spring Waters by Sergei Rachmaninoff. Instances of musical irony and existential inquiry throughout the piece are underscored by the composer's use of this quotation as the audience recalls the source musical material. So I'll now play for you the opening of Spring Waters. And then I'm going to have to, apologize, do this for my section. This is the opening of Shostakovich's Spring Awakening. So the opening melody within the piano accompaniment is repeated throughout the piece, returning in various iterations, but always within the opening key of F major. This motivic repetition calls upon the audience to consistently recall the familiar melody from a composer and a piece that they would have been an essential part of their upbringing and their cultural education. This implies cultural understanding as a means of calling back to an imperialist past in order to heighten expressivity present. Now, returning here to my map, the irony is that A section is the purple, and the next section I'm going to talk about is the contrasting B and C, which indicate mood shifts that heighten the emotions of the piece through ironic musical gestures. The B section features instances of incongruity, ambiguity, and exaggeration. And as the section progresses, these musical elements create a forward momentum that leads, as we can see here, to this realization of irony at the end. As a result, each appearance of incongruity, ambiguity, and exaggeration inform moments of irony that are underscored by this quotation of Rachmaninoff's Spring Waters. In the piano accompaniment of that returning refrain, each time the irony is realized, the quotation returns. Uniquely, the C section here, and as you can see, I have it highlighted in yellow, features an instance of what I'm calling a kind of realism. This indicates a more overt criticism. This section differs from all others as the harmony becomes intensely atonal, the meter shifts from 4/4 to a more unstable 3/2, and the texture of the piano accompaniment becomes more intense, tumultuous, and abandons this harmonious, lilting quality of Rachmaninoff that we've seen in the A sections of the piece. So, Sasha Chodany's text in this section, and here I have it in Russian, but I will speak it in English, highlights this text shifting from esoteric and heightened state of awareness in the opening to a more literal representation of reality. So this is seen in the lyrics as, quote, "But for many there is nothing. As in winter, there's nothing to eat. The trees are expectant, the water is stagnant, and there are more drunks around than ever," end quote. The text goes on to beg the all-powerful creator for relief, thanking them for bringing the spring. This segment sees the performer of the song speaking directly to an all-knowing just creator, reminiscent of the conversations with God that Tevye the milkman has as he comes to terms with God's mercy and his all-powerful justice. This text contrasts heavily with the opening lyrics of the piece, which we can see on the right, that reflect a more lighthearted with that lilting piano accompaniment reading, quote, "Yesterday my cat glanced at the calendar, instantly raised his tail like a trumpet, and raced out onto the stairs as in the old days, and started yelling loudly and maliciously, 'Spring marriages, common law marriages, quickly, all the cats to the attic.'" The next verse, after this, goes on to describe a cactus coming back to life from the dead like a new Lazarus flooded with tea leaves and coffee grounds. So, turning now to specific musical features of irony in the piece that present themselves, here is a representative example of incongruity that's seen in the following measures from measure 36 to 41. So here we see this metric incongruity that juxtaposes the mode and the timbre of the previous musical material. This section is in cut time with the accompaniment implying a marked like quality and vocal meter. And this type of rhythm could perhaps signify pride or patriotism, but because of the harsh articulation, the sudden textural change in the piano accompaniment, it takes on a sarcastic tone. Musical irony is additionally implied through the incongruity between this section and the rest of the piece, as well as exaggerations in timbre, texture, and dynamics. So following the sarcastic march, a representative example of ambiguity is seen here in this section for measures 42 to 45. Here, the meter suddenly changes to 3/2, and the clear tonality of A major in the previous section is now changed for a tonally ambiguous accompaniment and vocal line. This ambiguity implies a kind of musical irony as the piece continues to indicate A major while clearly meandering between tonalities every couple of beats. The vocal line is particularly interesting in regard to ambiguity because it sits in the middle of the soprano range. And as somebody who did indeed sing this set, and that is my recording, I can attribute to the fact that the consciousness of the breath support, engagement, onsets are very particular and risk falling under pitch at any moment, giving more ambiguity to this particular section. So there's additional humor implied by the descending nature of the vocal line, a kind of sigh or laugh, and sounds like a chromaticism that indicates a virtuosity from the singer. So, through the lens of these frameworks, the Satires reveals a unique sense of humor and irony of Shostakovich's compositional style. Through Jewish existential philosophy in ironic musical gestures, text setting, of Sasha Chodny's satirical poetry, and specific moments of shared cultural knowledge through quotation, Shostakovich infuses his music with an enduring thread of humor that finds its foundations not within the hopelessness of nihilism, but rather within the existential and moral inquiries of the Jewish ethos. This composition demonstrates an otherness that falls into the category of the unsaid but implied, leading to a liminality in which resistant expression could live and be tolerated. Laden with criticism, public humiliation, and threats to his life, Shostakovich's music always carries a thread of ironic humor, even in his most overtly tragic works. Perhaps Shostakovich's idiomatic humor was defined by his ironic existence, as he learned from those around him that one can easily laugh just as one can cry at the injustices of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. What an interesting paper and what a useful framework you devised for analyzing the irony, where all of that irony is commonly mentioned, and not just with reference to Shostakovich, but in much. One rarely sees such a concrete framework for analyzing. And if I may lead with a question of my own, I would be interested to know how you created that. Were you looking, who were you engaging with? Was it just called without?
Absolutely.
If you would mind.
Absolutely, yeah. And are you referring also to the map I created and the frameworks, or the frameworks themselves?
The frameworks themselves.
So these frameworks came from Esti Scheinberg, who is a wonderful musicologist who wrote a book about Shostakovich's irony, humor, parody, and the grotesque, which is fantastic. She goes into very deep analytic, hermeneutics of ironic expression, terminus, stimulus and all these sorts of very in-depth explanations.
Wonderful.
A lot of them have to do with a sort of cultural understanding or a sort of unsaid negotiation. And so really what she does is she spends 400 pages explaining the joke. I find fantastic and deeply nerdy. And that is where this sort of incongruity, ambiguity, and exaggeration as frameworks came. Now, these specific functions are my hearing, so my sort of analysis of the piece.
Wonderful. Please say the author's name and the work again.
Yes, S.D. Scheinberg. And the book is Irony, Parody, Humor, and the Grotesque in the works of Shostakovich.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Thank you for allowing me to indulge it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That's very interesting. When I see incongruities and exaggeration, that makes me think of Mahler. You see any connection between, I know they live in different physical worlds and Reesor has different things, but you see any similar things?
So thank you for your question. So something that's to me very interesting about this is the kind of exaggeration of affect. So when I think about Mahler, I think about really deep, really philosophical and meditative sort of affect. So personally, when I listen to Mahler, I don't hear quite the same irony in it as I do in Shostakovich. However, that kind of Jewish self-referential self-deprecation, wallowing in one's own sorrow, sort of kind of self-deprecation humor, I think is a way of finding like a light in the darkness. So while there isn't any maybe direct connection, I certainly think you could take a framework like this and explore other musical examples to see whether humor can be framed in this way specifically. Thank you.
If I may add to just there's something that's sometimes kind of that irony. And something, for example, or even on the first, I think there are moments where
I think that's that. Yeah, sorry. Just no, actually, I don't even. Okay. I think that if we talk about song title, 5 songs, implicit text, and discussion short, who is, I mean, language is important. Just remind me, Mahler did not speak Russian. Sasha Chorny is modernist. He's the first pretty much poet modernist in Russia. And yes, in his work, Jewishness is driving him into modern. Right? But another, I mean, it's, for me, it's a bush open. You begin from the end and develop it back. For me, Christ there's another, by Chotney, that's just there. I mean, that's reference to God's story. No, that's the mother, it's a joke, it's a necessary of the word, which said maybe by Jewish shtetl, but also by Russian.
I just want to say also quickly that I read a biography writes about the fact that when they were in their song together, the Shostakovich was just saying. So it was sort of very much towards nation, and just a part of Russian tradition, sort of reciting its culture becomes part of its state. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.